I think in Northern Ireland, the Middle East, and elsewhere, if I could have told people before they even engage in dialogue that your enemy or your perceived enemy is much closer to you than you imagine, that changes people's capacity to even engage in dialogue. It's like, oh, you're not asking me to compromise on profound things that threaten my group status. What you're saying to me is, I'm not being asked to compromise. You know, we have more in common. And so that's the power of this. And in getting this out is really key. And that's part of like why these forums and others are essential, and to partner with organizations like Scott's to say, you know, people need to know that this exists, but they can shape and think differently about this because there's evidence that we're not as far apart as we're led to believe.
Good evening and welcome to this evening's Ford Holt Forum at Suffolk University. America's Divided Mind, Understanding the Psychology that Drive Us Apart. I'm Michal Ben Yosef Hirsch, this evening's moderator, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and Legal Studies at Suffolk University. Deepening toxic polarization in the United States is a profound threat to the American people and to the very core of the American democracy. After 30 years of working around the globe to bring peace and reconciliation to deeply divided societies, Beyond Conflict launched an unprecedented research project in 2018 to assess the psychological factors that fuel polarization in our country. This groundbreaking study is the focus of this evening's program, where we will welcome Tim Phillips, the founder and the CEO of Beyond Conflict, and Scott Warren, the founder and CEO of Generations Citizen and a visiting fellow at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. The issues presented tonight are near to my heart. I teach and research international relations with a focus on transitional and historical justice and how they come to play in post-conflict reconciliation. I'm looking forward to see how these themes apply to the US. What brought us together to this forum is the report by Beyond Conflict, which we will discuss shortly. But it's actually a reality. Just if we open the newspapers today, that really bring us also to the same topic of polarization. If we look at just today's news, and I heard some reports about the debate about appointing a Supreme Court justice to replace Justice Bader Ginsburg. The debate is full with emotions and hatred and intensity. Beyond Conflict in the report offers a novel way to measure polarization in the United States. Tim, if you can share with us, what were the motivations for this research and how is it different from other ways that people study polarization in the US so far?
Thank you, Michal, and I want to thank all the people attending and participating. So after spending nearly 30 years working around the world, bringing together leaders in countries, often enemies, to try to imagine peace and transformation in countries going from conflict to peace or dictatorship to democracy, we started looking in this country 4 or 5 years ago at deepening polarization. And we saw elements of it here in the United States that we had seen in other countries. And in fact, about 10 or 15 years ago, a number of the leaders I worked with in the Middle East, Northern Ireland, South Africa, Central America, has said to me, you need to start looking at what's happening in your country. You need to start working in the United States. And I would respond, yes, I recognize there are some profound challenges here, but I didn't quite imagine or appreciate the way they did, sort of like canaries in a coal mine, what was developing in this country. And so what we decided to do is to look at the psychology of polarization. We started working with brain and behavioral scientists about a decade ago because there's so much profound knowledge about what it is to be human that we often miss by ignoring cognition and emotion. And our colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania started looking in a nationwide set of surveys, what is happening to the psychology of the American people through deepening polarization. And a lot of the traditional measures of polarization don't capture the psychology. And so that's what we really focused on. And we got some really disturbing, but also I think encouraging findings from that work.
So before we go to the findings, Scott, in your recent book, Generation Citizenship, you described, and I love this description, of the day after the 2016 elections, that you had to travel from LaGuardia in New York, and LaGuardia seemed like a funeral home. And then you got to Will Rogers Airport in Oklahoma City, and the atmosphere was much more optimistic. So is that what polarization looks like? And why is it good or bad for democracy?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Miguel. I really appreciate being here and excited to dive through this research as well. And so the organization that I helped co-found, Generation Citizen, is all about engaging young people to be active citizens through something that we call action civics, which is young people learning politics through doing politics. And so hopefully we can talk through. I think there have been some promises of getting through the polarization. And I think the work that Tim and his team have done, they can speak much more to the psychology and some of the research behind this as well. I'm excited to learn more. But you know, it is, Generation Citizen is all across the country. I was based in New York at the time. New York has, you know, not a monolithic way of thinking about politics, but there is a certain way that a lot of people think about politics there. And I've spent a lot of time in Oklahoma. We have a site in Oklahoma, in Oklahoma City. And on that day, it was literally the day after the election in 2016. And, you know, folks in New York, it was tears in the airport. And in Oklahoma, I think people were excited about what was to come. And I think it demonstrates that, and at the same time, and maybe this is the more hopeful part of it, we've worked with schools in Oklahoma that are more on the conservative end of things, that are really excited to do action civics, just as schools in New York would be excited to do action civics. So I think that there's some possibility there as well. But it was a reminder at the time, and I think when you talk through national levels of polarization, this can happen. It was a reminder of how we can live in different worlds within the same country. And I think that just in terms of seeing the drastic sense in the same day of how people were interpreting this event goes to what you were talking about at the beginning, probably of how people are seeing the Supreme Court nomination, that there are some people that think it's the death of democracy and some people that think that it's the best thing that's happened to the court in generations. And getting past that, I'm excited to hear from Tim, because that is probably the most existential threat to our democracy right now is how we actually push forward through that polarization too.
And so going back to you, Tim, how do you define polarization? Is it equal to partisanship, or what's the difference?
Well, you know, polarization exists in even a vibrant democracy. A local election for city council is not only partisan, you know, competition, but it's polarizing because you go out and you state some views that are often very different. In fact, I think back in the 1950s, there were political scientists saying that there wasn't enough difference between the Republican and Democratic parties, that we needed, in a sense, healthy polarization. Well, the reality is we're at the opposite end now. And the way we think about it is, you know, polarization around profound disagreement is one thing, but polarization around identity is very different and very dangerous. And that's where we are and heading towards in the United States. This is becoming identity-based polarization, and us versus them, almost sectarian form of polarization. And working with brain and behavioral scientists, one of the things we know when polarization becomes identity-based, a whole range of unconscious psychological processes come online that serve to drive us further apart. And as a non-scientist, you know, one of the most amazing things I learned in the last decade is nearly 90% of how we think is below the level of conscious access. So over the last 4 years, as I've read the news, watched television, and observed, you know, I think all of us would think, well, this seems unreasonable. You know, on both sides, all sides, why people will accept a view they didn't accept before, right? And what brain and behavioral scientists will tell us is that we're deeply social human beings, right? And that social identity marker or set of markers is always operating mostly unconsciously. But when we're feeling polarized, threatened as individuals, families, or communities, it sort of, in a sense, becomes sort of hyper driven. And so a lot of it happens unconsciously to discount information that threatens our group bonds. And so what we did in our report is we did a nationwide survey And we looked at very big contentious issues like open borders and immigration and gun control. But we looked at like and disliked, and when I get to dehumanization. And what we found was, this polarization is deepening. But at the same time, which we'll get to, a lot of it, to Scott's point, is based on people living in different bubbles, geographic bubbles, being in information bubbles, being in friendship bubbles, professional bubbles. And therefore, when we're not in contact with others, when everything we get is filtered through another source, and those sources have become, in a sense, very partisan, then what we think of the others becomes really tainted.
So let me go to this issue question, because I ask my students, I teach research methods now, and I asked them, how would you measure polarization? I gave them an exercise, and they said, we will go for the issues, the key thorny issues, such as immigration and gun control. And we see where does the positions, or where does the perceptions lay about? And you did that, Tim. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. I mean, to your point, if the only way you think of polarization is through issues, based on the research we did, is, for example, we would ask, Democrats or Republicans, and it's important to state that because we're really a two-party system in the United States, all the sort of identities and fissures and fault lines in this country sort of been aggregated in those two, core identities. And so what we would do is we would go to issues like open borders and immigration, as you see here. And we would ask, Republicans and Democrats, where are you as a Republican on open borders? And would ask a Democrat, where are you on open borders? And we would find that there's a lot of, profound disagreement, but there's a lot more agreement in the middle. But if you ask a Republican and a Democrat, this was last year, where do you think Republicans are on open borders? Majority of Democrats would say they want them completely closed. And Republicans would say about Democrats, they want the borders completely open. So you have this perception on issues, that is profoundly apart from each other. And to your point, on issues, there's a lot of overlap. So in a sense, polarization is not as intense. But what is, in a sense, filtering and modifying, as you can see in this slide here, is that we don't see how much we have in common. And part of the reason we don't recognize that is because we don't have a lot of contact. And our information sources, and I don't mean just the media or social media, but who we associate with, where we live, is filtering all this. And therefore, it's becoming this us versus them dynamic, which leads to identity-based polarization, and where the common sort of dynamics of issues get lost. And so, we did this as well on gun control, and found a lot of the same gap between people's perceptions of where they are in the issues and what the reality is. And so that's the key thing about doing this through the lens of brain and behavioral science, because what the scientists will do is not only ask, where are you on this issue? Where do you think other people in your party are on this issue? But this is really key. What do you think the other side thinks about your view? And it's interesting, that sort of brings on a whole set of different cognitive regions of the brain that have to do with identity. And so you get a lot more information by asking questions in that really important way.
So Scott, I was wondering, Tim, correct me if I'm wrong, you didn't ask questions such as issues of abortion and affordable care. And the reason I'm raising those, because these are the two issues in the news right now. Do you think the graph would look the same, either Scott or Tim? Scott, what do you think? Do you think the graph would look the same?
Yeah, I think the research is fascinating. I think I don't know, if they would be exactly the same on those issues. I think with something like healthcare, what I have read is that a lot of times people will be for or against the concept of something like Obamacare without actually understanding what's in it. And when they understand the specifics of what's in it, I think that that's where the moderations actually do come in, at least from my perspective on that. But I think that the points here are so important in the extent to what I've read, and again, I think Tim's done great research on this, is that the demonization that happens of people from other parties is such to the extent that we don't take the actual opportunity to engage with folks. So we're not talking to them through issues because we're not talking to them, period. And Democrats think, and the stats show that this is much more than it's been in the past, that Democrats think that Republicans are, in many cases evil, and vice versa. And so it becomes much more difficult to actually have conversations about these issues if the starting point that you have is they don't want what's best for the country. And so I think that definitely seems to be happening. And it seems like that's what the media likes to portray in many cases as well.
And can I just ask Mikhail to follow up on your question on what Scott said? Not only did we look at issues of gun control and open borders and immigration, we did not look at abortion or the Supreme Court, but we also looked at, I mentioned like and dislike, how much you think the other side likes or dislikes you, and how much you like or dislike the other side. But then on dehumanization, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But that's a really profound and blunt instrument to ask how much you think the other side dehumanizes you, sees you as fully less than human. And when that happens, when you think, wait a minute, the other side doesn't see me and my community and family and group as fully human, well, then that's when your capacity to disregard democratic norms, democratic institutions, and treating people as fellow citizens really starts to decline. And one of the things we looked at was, okay, what is the consequences of identity-based polarization? So we say identity-based polarization is toxic because it leads to a lot of bad outcomes. And it starts to tear apart the social fabric of that, yeah, we have profound disagreements, but yeah, we're citizens of the same nation, to know they are threatening our very core identity. And when we ask people how much you think the other side dehumanizes you, it's up nearly 50% over what they expected. In other words, on issues on like and dislike and dehumanization, like what we showed on gun control and immigration, there are some disagreements, but what they think the other side thinks about them and their position is nearly double. And so Democrats and Republicans, as uncomfortable as it is, but we've done this in 13 countries around the world, and it's pretty consistent. If it's the ascent of man scale, which is a blunt instrument of early primates all the way to humans, and on a scale of 0 to 100, you ask in other countries and here, where would you place these groups? So when you'd ask a Democrat or Republican, they would place people in their own party at about 85, 87, and Republicans would do the same. So that's unfortunately not unusual. And then when you would ask where as a Democrat you place Republicans and Republicans place Democrats, it's a bit less, but not huge. But when you ask them, how much do you think the other side dehumanizes you? Then it's off the charts double. And that is really frightening. And that's when we think of it as becoming toxic.
So I want to follow on that, because dehumanization is, as you define it, is the act of seeing the other as less than human. That's a very strong statement. Now, scholars of conflict, like we're used to observe and measure dehumanization in intense ethnic conflicts, in cases of leading to genocide, that involve a lot of violence. And you're finding that similar tendencies are characteristics of domestic politics in the US. So what is the relationship between dehumanization and violence? And should we be worried about violence, given that there is so much dehumanization?
Unfortunately, yes, in this country. So one of the slides showed what are the consequences of toxic identity-based polarization is the willingness to use democratic institutions to harm your opponent and decreasing trust and confidence in democratic institutions. Now, separately, we had, and we have an ongoing project on decoding dehumanization, and we came out with a policy brief 2 years ago. And we try to, like with polarization, unpack the psychology of dehumanization. it's a word that's often used. It's like the word empathy. And we said, okay, are we using empathy correctly? Are we using the word dehumanization correctly? What does it mean psychologically to dehumanize another? And, when we objectify others, like women, that is a form of dehumanization. When you see groups of people in what they call sort of mechanistic ways, that they're all sort of like these automatons, that's a form of dehumanization. But the dehumanization we tend to all be most familiar with is the animalistic dehumanization. In World War II, when the Nazis referred to Jews as rats, or more recently of people coming over the border as rapists and others, it really dehumanizes them. It strips them of their minds, their identity, their humanness. And what we have found is when people are dehumanized, particularly in animalistic ways, when language is used against them, the scientists and researchers says it's a precursor to violence. It sets the cognitive framework in our minds to either engage in, look the other way, or accept dehumanizing behavior towards others. And we started this measurement looking at the Roma in Europe and trying to figure out how much are the Roma being dehumanized versus other groups in the country. And we've done it in 13 countries around the world. And so for the study, we brought it to this country and said, are we seeing some of the same dynamics? And we are, because dehumanization is not confined to the international world, a setting. It's a human experience, right? So, you look at what's happening here. I mean, racism is dehumanization. And that's been going on here for centuries. And so that is not new to the United States. And we're seeing the ugly face of that more and more and more. And so, yeah, it exists, but that's why we did this study, to say, let's unpack this. I mean, long before the pandemic, we started looking at polarization as a public health threat to the nation. And we needed to understand scientifically what the challenge was, and then how do we address it? And so we're at that stage of having done the initial analysis and now looking at how to address this, which is why it's exciting to engage with leaders like Scott, who are out there trying to engage, particularly a younger generation, in shaping the future of this country and getting them exposed to this sort of knowledge.
So Scott, really, I know you haven't studied it, but I'm asking you from your observation and working with young kids, because I'm curious, do young kids also exhibit this dehumanization? Is it something that we acquire as we become older? Is it an adult thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I do think that the skills of dialogue and the skills of the skills of understanding how to disagree. So I think sometimes we talk about how do we get people to agree more. I think it's more, how do you learn how to disagree with fellow citizens? I think that can be taught. And that's something that we focus on teaching in our classrooms. I think what's so important about this is Tim was talking earlier that polarization itself is a necessary component of politics and a democracy. So I think folks that say, well, we all just need to get together, that's not how things work. And you can see this in communities. I mean, my father right now is running for city council in a place called Del Mar in San Diego, which is very much a liberal enclave. But the type of arguments that are happening in this community show the levels of polarization that have nothing to do with things like abortion and top issues, but are, I think, a healthy dialogue on issues like affordable housing and short-term rentals. And I think that's valid. I think that they don't necessarily know how to disagree with each other either. But I think what's so important is, how do we instill democratic values in the youngest generations so they understand, the importance of that democracy is not about winning all the time, but it's about understanding that you put your point forward and other people put their point forward, and then there has to be some sort of disagreement, and that just because someone disagrees with you, that dehumanization should not occur. And so that's something that I do see happening in our classrooms, is young people recognizing, oh, this person who lives in a different area than me or lives across the street from me, might have different viewpoints, but that's okay. And I'm going to learn how to actually engage with them. And I do think that young people, that what you're seeing is statistics that show that they generally tend to be more tolerant in most cases, which means that I think that that there's definitely room for polarization to subside. I do think that there's sometimes challenges of not understanding the fact that dialogue is necessary in democracy and that polarization is necessary. And I think that part of the debate, which Tim touches on, I think is so critical, which is it's not polarization in itself that is a bad thing. It is effective polarization, is the demonization of folks. And it seems like there's a lot of the filter bubbles that are emerging in terms of where folks live and in terms of where people engage with each other that will lead to harmful results down the line.
And can I just, I'm sorry, Mikhail, just on what Scott was saying, is, looking at this, it's very deeply concerning for the future of our nation with all the issues we have to confront, that there are these levels of sort of toxic polarization. But this is the key sort of encouraging in the midst of all this concern, is a lot of this belief is based on false perception. In other words, we think the other side dehumanizes us at 50% when they actually don't. We think they dislike us at nearly 50% when they actually don't. We think we have nothing in common on key issues when there's actually a lot of overlap in the middle. And so the reality is that these gaps in reality are shaping how we actually think and act. And that's what we try to unpack, which is, again, going back to the psychology of this. What is happening? And if left unaddressed, like a public health threat, how will this spread? And how will it actually permanently change the way people view each other? And that's why with Scott and many other organizations, we're like, we got to get this information out and get it out in different ways. Because think of it in your own personal lives. If you think somebody you liked, you found out greatly disliked you, it changes your way of thinking. And the reverse happens. Oh, I thought they really didn't like me. Actually, they do. And it literally has a cognitive shift, right? And the other key thing is, and Scott touched upon this, and I found this in my 30 years of work trying to promote dialogue in different conflict zones. It's really difficult to bring people together who have dehumanized each other over decades and centuries, in many cases, right? Where there's great fear, mistrust, there's been loss, suffering, humiliation, exclusion. There's a huge emotional, political, economic cost to bring people together when there's been no preparation, right? And it takes a long time. But, when I think of this research, I think in Northern Ireland, the Middle East, and elsewhere, if I could have told people before they even engage in dialogue that your enemy or your perceived enemy is much closer to you than you imagine, that changes people's capacity to even engage in dialogue. It's like, oh, you're not asking me to compromise on profound things that threaten my group status. What you're saying to me is I'm not being asked to compromise. We have more in common. And so that's the power of this. And then getting this out is really key. And that's part of why these forums and others are essential, and to partner with organizations like Scott's to say, people need to know that this exists, but they can shape and think differently about this because there's evidence that we're not as far apart as we're led to believe.
So, because as you highlight, Tim, it has a lot to do with mutual false perceptions. And I'm actually pulling with some of the questions that were submitted earlier, even before the webinar. So people ask about and I know it was not part of your research, but I was wondering if you can comment on that, on those sources of those false misperceptions. Like, where do they come from? Some people suggest obviously the silos of the social media, but maybe we can think about other things, that what causes those false perceptions, and do they get more intensified now? Do we have less polarization 10 years ago than we have now, toxic polarization?
Yeah, so it comes from the sort of loss of local media in the United States. So where people get their news is not only concentrated in fewer and fewer media sources, but those media sources have become hyperpartisan in many cases, not all, or they're perceived to be hyperpartisan, and so people from one side or the other ignore them. So we're getting our information in silos. There's less local media. Of course, social media has an influence, but it's not as big as, frankly, some other researchers have found. It's people living literally away from each other, not living in the same communities, not going to the same schools, not going to the same churches, right? And leaders have a huge influence. The reason why identity-based polarization drives so many unconscious ways of thinking and behavior is because our brain is very attuned to group identity. And part of group identity is leaders. Who are the leaders of that group and the norms they set? And so, you don't have to look far to see leaders that are setting and using language that drive us further apart. And it's not just on one side. I've seen it around the world in various sides, right? So it's a number of things. But, 30 years ago, research found that unfortunately, a white family would say, well, I'm not sure if I want my son or daughter to marry a person of a different race. Now it's the opposite. I wouldn't want my son or daughter to marry somebody of a different party. And so if people aren't even willing to engage with each other, date each other, accept marriage, we're just deepening these silos.
Scott, is that what you also see in the younger kids, the same silos?
Well, I think a lot of this seems to be, and I've read research on that, I mean, a lot of it seems to be geographic. And so I think that there are, if you look at 2016 compared to earlier elections, just in terms of landslide counties, counties that a particular candidate won by, I think, 15 or 20 percentage points more, I mean, that increased dramatically. There are just places where folks, just live closer to people that think like them, and it's much less likely for people to know people of the opposite political party. So I think that those all seem to be what I do struggle with a bit, and I'm curious to get thoughts on this as well. And I saw there's a question on this. Is there some extent to which I think it's I think it is problematic that folks are not engaging with each other as much. And I see this among young people too. And I think that they probably go a little deeper than this in the sense that one of the challenges that I find that we're trying to do something about too is I think that there is probably too much of a focus on national politics. And the focus on national politics actually increases polarization. Because the more that you focus on local politics, the less that you focus on some of this. It's very difficult sometimes. Even you look at the stats around gun control, you look at the stats around abortion. I think that Tim's right in that you can get to the middle. But if you look at things like housing in San Diego, where I am right now, that's actually a complicated issue where people from different sides of the aisle are going to feel different things. It's not just by Democrats or Republicans. So I think one of the things that has to happen is you need more engagement. But the other thing is that we need to figure out how there's more of a focus on local issues. And that's incumbent on our education system. That's incumbent on all of us. But it seems like the focus on the hyper national, which it just seems like all media is about, means that there is a greater likelihood that polarization and that perceived polarization will continue to occur as well.
Okay, so it seems like we already kind of highlighted three kind of to-dos in order to change. We're talking about engagement, we're talking about transition to local politics, we're talking about maybe providing information, actual information, in order to bypass the misperceptions. What are some of the interventions, Tim, that you find that come up from your research?
Thank you. So sort of going back to that public health analogy, so doing the research as a way of assessing what is the problem we're dealing with, and then how do you address it and what recommendations. So what we're developing right now and exploring are like the equivalent of a voter's guide on polarization. Now, we live in a big country of over 330 million Americans. And as Scott said, we live almost in many different countries in this big country of ours, right? And so that's always been the case. So what we're looking at is our colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania are actually online studying the best way to correct these misperceptions and how long does that correction last? Because when people go back out into the world, they get, this onslaught of media, colleagues, family. We live in a sense in this big cognitive ecosystem that keeps on, hitting us with information. And so one of the things we're looking at, for example, is do we do it in an animation form? Is it a short video and put it out there? What is the framing that reaches people and they think, okay, there's much more in common than I imagined. How long does that cognitive shift last? We know there's a cognitive shift where people feel like, oh, okay, I do have more in common. There's less at thread here. So one thing we're hoping to do is we're working with this great organization, One America, to look at a Christian evangelical guide on polarization and work with some large churches in the Midwest and get this information out through these ministers and pastors to, huge numbers of their congregants in terms of what they need to understand about the nature of polarization. Because people want to know, in a sense, how they're being manipulated. And it's not even necessarily direct manipulation. In many cases it is. It's just a reality of the way we take in knowledge and information. So we're also working with the media. So actually we've been doing work with Ground Truth at WGBH for the last 2.5 years, actually doing workshops for journalists on understanding the psychology of polarization, but also sort of brain basics. Most journalists are not taught in journalism school the nature of confirmation bias or how we process sacred values, things that we perceive to be sacred to us. Like for many, and I don't mean just in religious terms, like for a lot of Americans who really feel strongly about the Second Amendment, they process that almost as if it's a sacred value. And when somebody tries to get them to compromise it, they hold on more aggressively and they respond in a negative way. There's actually neuroimaging that shows that anything we hold to be sacred to us gets processed in a different region of the brain than every other calculation. And so working with journalists to say, you need to understand that narratives get processed in different ways based on who's taking it in and who's giving it. And so there are different things we're looking at to get this information out. And one is working with some, dialogue groups across the United States and trying to give them the best tools that takes in best of experience and insights from brain and behavioral science about how to maybe hold these dialogues in ways that don't reinforce either negative misperceptions, stereotypes, or just make it difficult to engage.
So Scott, from your experience of the last over a decade that you're working, is your intervention will address the issues, the problems that we've raised here?
I think it is one of many that are probably needed. So what we actually do is, as I said, it's something called action civics education in schools. And young students choose an issue that they care about and then take some sort of action. I think the ways in which we're addressing some of the challenges here, one is, it's an activity we do where students have to choose one issue to tackle as a class. And so some students might want to choose homelessness, and some might want to choose teen jobs, and they have to figure out how do we actually come together to choose one issue. And you actually see that's a little bit of like, let's actually learn how to disagree with each other and come to some sort of compromise. There also is something that happens is we do focus on local politics, and we really push for understanding how local politics works. The other thing that I think is important is that there has to be almost a polarization self-awareness. And this is something that we push as well, is how do you think about the different trade-offs that happen? And I myself have to sometimes think, okay, am I seeing this through a partisan lens, or let me question how I'm actually seeing things. I think about it some of the time. We don't need to get into something on diatribe on social media, but sometimes when you're watching a TV program or watching a movie, you have your own opinions on it, and then you look and you see what other people's opinions on it, and then that influences what yours are before you even have your own opinions. And so some of what you have to do is let me check why I'm thinking the way that I am. And that's something that we teach our students as well. Let's think about the trade-offs here. Let's think about, are you actually analyzing the root causes of this and almost having some self-awareness around the opinions that you have. So we are trying to teach that all. We are just one part of an education system, but I think that there's a lot that our education system can do. And again, I think it's getting beyond the issues, but getting to some of these democratic values that do have to be instilled. And I will say that this is one of those things that sometimes folks say, well, are people too far on the right or left to actually engage in these? I do think that there's democratic values that have to be held true. And that's far more important than than agreeing on certain issues is how do you actually think about these democratic values as well?
Well, yeah, I'm pushing always the question from Scott about the next generation, because I'm looking for some hope there and some changes in a way. And in January, the Pew Research Center took an early look at the US electorate. And in 2020, nearly a quarter of the electorate, about 23%, will be of the ages of 65 and older. These are the so-called baby boomer generation. And I believe we have even a graph on that we can share with our audience. So they're actually now, it's for the first time that they do represent a declining share, those older, the older people. And what we do see a little bit of a flattening of the millennials, those who will be ages 24 to 39 in 2020. But we do see what is rising is the so-called Generation Z, Gen Zs, ages 18 to 23, that grew from 4% to 10%, 4% in 2016 to 10% today. And I was wondering, first of all, we don't know if they vote. That's the big question, if they will vote. We hope they will. But I was wondering, do you think that will change polarization just by changing the demographic of the participants in the democratic debate?
I mean, I think it's a fascinating question. I think that one would hope that yes. I do think that we're hopeful, and I don't mean this from a political perspective. I just mean this from a caring about democracy perspective, that more young people participate. So obviously, it's one thing to say that they're going to be part of the electorate. It's another thing to say that they're going to participate. I do tend to think that the more people that you have participating, the less polarized things become. And so I think just on the aggregate, I guess I would answer that it's just important that more people actually participate. I tend to think it's a good aggregate that more young people participate too. I think that there's data out there, and I've seen recent trends that young people still tend to trend more liberal, and older people tend to trend more conservative, but that's not something that's changed. That's something that's been the case for a long time. I will say, and I'm not sure how this affects polarization, young people are more and more likely to not affiliate with any specific political party. And so I think that could be a positive in that they're looking for solutions. They're not necessarily looking to put a political party front and center. So I think we'll have to see is part of what I'm saying.
Yeah, and can I just add, Mikhail, that I think you both said the role and the importance of sort of shared democratic values. The problem is that the notion that those values are being shared has been eroded, right? And that's the problem when it becomes an us versus them form of polarization. It's like, we don't share values. It's not just that you threaten me and don't see me as fully human, or I perceive you to dislike me, that we don't have a lot in common at the core in terms of issues and of values. And that's not true. And it's when you think we don't have those, in a sense, sacred values in common, then and that's where it ties also to dehumanization, then the sort of the precursor and the sort of tipping point to allowing harm to happen to others, looking the other way, starts to emerge. And I think we just have to recognize that just stating democratic values isn't sufficient. It's finding what those values people have in common across all these divides. And one of those values is to be treated with respect and dignity. And if there's one thing I've learned separate from this research, but in 30 years of conflict work in 75 countries, is that exclusion is the main driver of conflict. That at the end of the day, even people who try to kill each other as paramilitaries or others, it's they recognize when their dignity is violated. And they know what it feels like to be dehumanized. So talking about dehumanization could be an abstract thought, but to say, well, what does it feel like to actually be dehumanized? You know, across all these divides, that's part of the human experience. And one of the most important things I learned from scientists is one of the key things we're constantly doing all the time in milliseconds is scanning the world around us and asking the question, what do other people think about me and us? And that's really, really important. And, you know, it's tied to this because it's if we get caught up on partisanship and polarization around issues and like and dislike, which is important to recognize, but those shared democratic values can become very abstract until you create that connective tissue of what everybody, no matter what, wants and needs. And that's what also science confirms that we all know empirically and intuitively, is that we want to be treated with respect and have our identities understood and valued as we see ourselves. That's the precondition to thinking rationally, is to know that other people see you the way you're, or at least recognize you as you see yourself.
So I have so many questions of my own, but we have actually questions from the audience that I'm supposed to convey. And I want to encourage our audience, please do type your questions because we are getting to them right now. So one question that actually has been repeated a few times is the question about social media. And isn't that a little bit of a lost cause now, because we are kind of tailing behind the barriers and the misinformation and the dehumanization the social media is spreading? So is that a lost battle, or what's the role of social media, or can we use social media to reverse that? Team.
Well, I have to say I'm not an expert on social media, but yeah, I mean, getting out information through every platform and every form is absolutely essential. I mean, one of the big questions I have, and some research I'd love to have done, is how many people are actually, what's the word, devouring, you know, using this social media messaging, and the fact that it shapes their opinion. I mean, I think if we really want to focus on what has the biggest impact, it's leaders, whether it be in politics, government, major institutions, media leaders, cultural leaders, religious leaders, have a huge sort of oversized influence on a normative environment, right? Norms, what we think others think, has a huge impact on human behavior. And so, you know, the more we can recognize that and focus on that, and then figure out what is the strategy. I mean, let's be honest, you know, we're in a moment of true existential democratic crisis and legitimacy. This is where people have to stand back and get back to the point that you and Scott talked about values. You know, I wish I can give you a bit better answer on social media. I'm just not as totally informed and deep research on that. But it certainly has a huge influence because it's a conveyor of knowledge and information.
I can just hop in on the youth side. I mean, stats show that for millennials, which Gen Z is now younger than millennials, but upwards of 60% use Facebook as their primary source for news. And so it is, there's a lot of studies that have been put out to demonstrate that on spaces like social media, on Facebook, et cetera, there are filter bubbles that we are naturally a part of. And so I think that this is a challenge. I mean, I echo that we're in a moment of democratic crisis. I do think that how people get their news, and I think, I mean, this is me opining a little bit that, that these, I mean, there has to be more regulation in social media companies need to consider themselves not as bystanders, but of actual purveyors of news and information, as not agnostic platforms. And so I think that that's just something that seems like there's energy on. And I actually think one of the only things that I actually think you can probably find national bipartisan agreement on is that more has to be done to regulate big tech. And I think that includes social media. But I do think that with young people specifically, if they're just using social media to get news, it is going to be a challenge because there is a lot of disinformation that is out there.
Yeah, I have to admit that just from a personal experience, when I asked my students where about polarization, they said we would study TikTok because that's where we get most of our information from. So this is where they would like to study polarization, is by studying the app of TikTok. So that's definitely a lot to still study there about social media in order to understand that. A really interesting question that came out from the audience, Tim, have you found that societies can reach some kind of a tipping point that beyond that, the dehumanization is so high that no engagement can work?
That's a really good question. I mean, we have been looking at dehumanization in different countries where there's a lot of violence. I mean, we saw in Rwanda, for example, where that language of treating and dehumanizing people through an animalistic lens really was a precursor to genocide and ethnic cleansing. And so one of the things we've looked at is sort of looking at language that's coming out on radio, television, newspapers, and media. And there are certain words, you know, rat, vermin, that create disgust reactions, like pathogen threaten humans. I mean, we actually process disgust differently in the brain than fear. And so when a lot of those words start percolating in a country, then that should be an early warning that we could be heading to a really horrible form of dehumanization, of Rwanda type, Balkan type behavior. And so that's one of the things in a couple of countries we're looking at right now. In this country, we've been testing with our colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania on immigration. Some of the leading immigration reform organizations have been concerned if their messaging is actually counterproductive. So using the best of intuition, are they actually reinforcing negative norms? Are they reinforcing stereotypes? Are they priming threats based on stereotypes? And so we're testing that to see, is a rational message that immigrants are not committing huge numbers of crimes effective, or one that sort of promotes empathy? And so, you know, there are different levels of dehumanization, but really trying to understand that is really key. And as it relates to this country, we see what people think about how the other side dehumanizes them. And the risk down the road is potentially significant.
So another good question from the audience is whether this whole polarization discourse is not in itself a partisanship stance. And the way they put it, are there people actually that are Republican who are even interested in overcoming polarization? Or is polarization in itself a partisanship stance? Scott, you mentioned the democratic values are important for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I would answer this. I think that I will say that I think there's been research done. This is, I don't sort of like the both sidesism all the time, but there's research done on how many democratic norms are people willing to violate in order to get what they want done. And this is something that's increasing from both parties right now, right? Is that you're seeing a little bit more of a sense of, well, it's not about sort of kumbaya, it's about getting what we need done. And this is a question I have, because I think, and this is why I push on the local so much, because I think it has to filter up. But I think that there probably is And I will say too, I don't think that getting rid of polarization is about just getting moderates. And I don't think anyone thinks that. I think it's just about ensuring that people understand the importance of disagreement. And I think that that's probably a better way of framing it there. But no, I don't think it's a partisan issue. I do think that there are probably folks on both sides that do think that that what is more important than process is outcome. And I think democracy is about process, and it's about expressing the will of the people, and that polarization at its worst is a breakdown in the process. But I think that framing it as that getting rid of polarization as partisan is probably not right.
And if I may actually answer, as a moderator also answer, I actually think, Tim's, your data shows that it's not just a partisanship thing, because if we remember the graphs we showed earlier, both Democrats and Republicans were feeling dehumanized, and they had perceptions that the other side is hating them. So it's not something unique to just one side. To the feeling. It was almost a symmetrical distribution. So
yeah, and just sort of anecdotally, when we released this report, we actually got a lot of coverage in what you call center-right conservative press. And they were very encouraging and supportive of it. And a National Review journalist did a review of the paper. And when I called him to thank him, he said that his analysis of our report led to more comments on his website, personal emails, and people stopping him where he lives in Tennessee at the supermarket, thanking him. And they're all conservative. And he said, people want a country that functions. Putting aside politics, they just want to live and do their daily stuff, right? They just want a society and a country that functions. They want people to figure out a way to work together. And so I think what people found encouraging is what they hear and what's reinforced in their communities is that things are really, really bad. And things are bad. But there's a path forward. And we need to figure a way to get that knowledge out there and information out there. And I noticed one of the questions was about people just not liking Congress, knowing each other, living next to each other. And that's spot on true. I mean, I know in the work in Northern Ireland and in other countries that people on both sides of the divides, actually, when they were in prison together, whether you be Protestant paramilitaries or IRA members, once they actually were forced to get to know each other in prison, they became, in many cases, friends. They've had far more in common than they ever imagined. And so finding ways to break down those barriers, particularly in Congress, is also important. But other ways of doing this, very practically, I think will have an impact over time.
Thanks. Scott, there's actually one question one of the members of the audience would like to hear more about how you teach to disagree. How do you actually teach people to disagree?
Yeah, I mean, we try in our program, as I said, to figure out, okay, there's one issue you have to actually come to consensus on and figure out, how do you actually come to consensus? I think one of the things that's important too, that we try to do is that we have activities where we ensure that students are able to voice their opinions and then back up their opinions and have discussions about that, and recognizing that people can have different discussions. And so that might start with, dogs are better than cats, and people are going to think different things about that. It might then go to my government cares about me and my opinion, and actually having an opinion on that. And it might be that healthcare is a right versus healthcare is a privilege, and having conversations on that. I think that notion though, and this is stuff that needs to be in classrooms. And I will say that one of the things that research has found is, especially in a polarized time, teachers are reluctant to teach about controversial issues. They're reluctant to teach about politics, and they're reluctant to teach about controversial issues because they don't receive much training on how to do this, and they're worried that parents are gonna are gonna talk to their students and say, oh, our teachers are trying to indoctrinate our kids with X or Y. And so I think that one of the things that has to be done is that educators and schools need to prioritize teaching about democracy and politics, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. If you're not talking about this election right now in your classrooms, you can be sure, and especially in a virtual area, but you can be sure that students are talking about it on their own. But that students need to be encouraged to talk about their opinions when it's backed up. And I think that research and backing up their own opinions, you can teach this and you can teach research, but then also, and this is something that I think needs to be taught in schools generally, but I think goes to polarization, students need to be taught how to listen. And I think that this is all something that as a society we could use a lot more of, but what does it mean to actively listen? What does it mean to listen to what someone's opinion is, to what their lived experiences are, to, Tim's talked about this with dehumanization. Partially that just results in a lack of empathy and a lack of listening to people. And so I think if you actually take the time, if I don't agree with your opinions and I say, well, you're a terrible person, that's not effective. I might be right, but that's not effective. Whereas if I take the time to listen, and actually say, okay, why do you think this? This is why I think that. So I just think that actual, the notion of teaching how to listen is something that's incredibly important.
And Tim, someone is asking, we talked about dislike, we talked about misperception, we talked about dehumanization. What about hate?
What about hate? Well, we didn't analyze hate. It's really interesting. Over the last decade, when I would talk to really some brilliant young brain and behavioral scientists, I said, I'd really like to understand how we process humiliation. And there's very little research in brain and behavioral science about the sort of neural correlates and processing of humiliation. That's something we want to do. What about contempt? And we know from, I mentioned a dehumanization where there's been a fair amount of research that disgust and fear get processed differently, right? So I can't answer hate other than I know it's a really destructive emotion. But I want to say something that I think ties to what's been said. What really got me interested in looking at brain and behavioral science was I was teaching a course at a local university on conflict transformation, the human dimension. And I had Jerry Adams come in from Northern Ireland. And a student asked him, how do you sit across the table from somebody you may have tried to kill, or they may have tried to kill you? And he paused and he said, it's tough to make peace with a humiliated partner. And there was a retired neuroscientist sitting in the room, and he came up to me afterwards and said, when I hear these themes of humiliation or empathy or fear, he said, there's a lot of brain science behind some of this. And I questioned him. I said, I don't know, what do you mean by brain science? I understand social psychology and so forth. And he said something so powerful. He said, speaking as a scientist, we are not rational beings with emotions. In fact, we're just the opposite. We're emotionally based beings who can only think rationally when we feel that our identities are understood and valued by others. He said, literally the ability to engage in reason and rational thinking with another is to feel that your identity is understood. And your identity of yourself, we can think of in our own friends and families, may not reflect reality, but if that's how you feel at that moment, you need to have that seen. And I think that gets to a lot of the dialogue across divides. And we're at a point, we're starting to look at bringing in leaders from other countries, not to tell Americans what to do, but to share experience, who are deeply concerned about what's happening in this country. They struggled with us versus them mindsets. They wanted to go to a you and I sort of view of the world, and they see it happening here. But it's the ability to feel understood as you see yourself is not just a very nice construct. There's a biological necessity to it. To feel understood has a biological basis. And I think we need to find more and more of those pathways if we're going to really, break down these divides. Not change people on their views necessarily, but create the capacity for people to actually hear each other.
So I'm going to ask another question here. So when you say people have the need to be understood, is it each individual person, or is it the leaders? Who are we trying, who needs to be understood?
Well, I could tell you're a good professor, Mikhail. Well, I think it starts with the individual. But, because going back, we're very social beings, our identities are not constructed based in a state of individual being, right? It's also part of a family and a community, a social group. So, I think at the core, it's as an individual feeling understood is really the first part. And then as part of a group, and it really, I think, depends on how core your identity is tied to a group identity. Not all group identities have the same sort of attachment, right? Some of them may be loose, some of them may be strong. We see this in countering violent extremism. Why do people often join gangs or violent groups? Is looking for a place of belonging. And so it's different for each person, but it's both. It's both as an individual and part of a group. And I think it depends not only on the group, but the individuals as well.
So I have thank you, Tim. I have another question here to Scott about what he hears about cancel culture. What do you think are the consequences of people, especially youth, engaging in this type of polarization? Because you're more our voice of the young people.
I'm not as young as I used to be. I think cancel culture has come to mean a lot without us actually understanding what it means, right? And so I think that's important in that I think it's become sort of this catch-all. And I think that sometimes there are people that are in the public sphere that engage in pretty nefarious things that should be called out to accountability for that. I don't see that as council culture as much as I see that about accountability to some extent. I don't think that young people want this. That it's just about when you disagree with someone, canceling them. And I think that sometimes there's a perception of that. And again, I think sometimes social media can feed into the worst of this. I do think that there is a real conversation happening about what does it mean to have dialogue and who are we comfortable espousing viewpoints. This is something that's happening a lot on college campuses, just in the sense of who are we comfortable speaking with. And it's challenging. I mean, one thing that Tim sort of alluded to earlier, but that is important to talk about is I do think in this country specifically, there's a lot of challenges in talking about race. And I think that one of the biggest challenges that we have in our democracy is the fact that we are becoming a very multi-ethnic democracy, and in the history of the world, it's that you don't see this really happening, where you don't have one ethnic group that's in the majority, and so I think that's something that has to be talked about. But I think that's at the core of a lot of what young people are doing. So I will say again, I think cancel culture is a concept in which you are not listening to people you disagree with would be a bad thing. I don't think that's necessarily at the heart of what it is. I think it's sort of a nuanced conception of it, but part of what I will say is that nuance is an important part of our politics that needs to return, and nuance is something that I think would lead to less effective polarization. So I just think that's something that's important to think about as well.
Do you think this cancel culture plays into the next stage of polarization?
Is that to me, Mikhail?
Yeah, sorry.
It becomes just another talking point. In other words, it becomes another thing to hook polarization on. See, they're different. They hate us. They hate you, right? They're attacking you because of your identity, or because you're speaking out, or because you're defending your group, or you're defending your values, right? I, to be honest, am more concerned about the negation of people's identities as they see themselves on both sides, on all sides. If there's one thing I've learned from work around the world, one of the great honors of my life is knowing and having Nelson Mandela on our advisory board. And when we would take people from Northern Ireland, the Balkans, and other countries to South Africa, when he was still there, he would say, be tough on structures and institutions, but not on people. Do not be tough on people. And there was a moment when he came out of prison in 1990, the great moment when he was speaking to the world. he got a speech draft from a speechwriter. And when the speechwriter sat down with Mandela in 1990, there were all these handwritten corrections. And one of them was that Mandela wrote about his prisoner, meaning F.W. de Klerk, the then president of South Africa. F.W. de Klerk is an honorable man. And the speechwriter said, Madiba, which they called him, you can't say that. You're coming out of nearly 30 years of prison. Your people have suffered. You just can't say that. And Mandela reached across just to the speechwriter and said, it is up to him to disprove it. Think of that he had such political and moral authority that he said, I need to create a bridge for my oppressor to walk across with me. I need to find a way forward. And what he did was recognized something profoundly powerful about not only his identity, but also the identity and the threats across this divide. And how do I give him a bridge? How do I help him? And I've seen elements of this. John Hume did it in the 80s, meeting with the IRA in Northern Ireland and others, right? And so to me, when I think of cancel culture, we can get really upset, but if you unpeel it, it's about negation of identity. And I think a core of bridging divides is allowing people to change, allowing people not to change necessarily their perceptions, but maybe their misunderstanding and fear of the other.
By way of concluding, I want to pose something to you. I'm giving you all the research in the world right now. And I would ask you, what would you do in the short and in the long term in order to change this picture that we described here of this toxic dehumanization, toxic polarization? So I'll start with you, Scott. I give you all the resources in the world to plan a short and a long-term solutions.
Sure, the short-term solution is challenging. I don't know. I think I would need to, to think on the short term. I do think that there are. The short term is that there's maybe the short term, and I don't mean this in a partisan perspective, is just having a effective and peaceful election. I think that that's actually pretty important for the future of polarization in this country, because I think things can get a lot worse on that if that does not happen. And so maybe that's one way of thinking about it. In the long term, what I care about a lot, I'd say a few things. So one is an education system that values civics and democracy at the forefront, that teaches educators how to think about controversial issues, that teaches active listening skills, and a society that really thinks about local politics and has some sort of self-awareness around partisanship too. So that we're all thinking actively, do I think this? Am I thinking this because I'm a member of a tribe that's pushing me to think a certain way? And then I do believe in, one of the things that I think about polarization right now is, as Tim said, it's become an identity more than just a political thing. We shop at certain places, we like different sports, all of that. And so I think because we watch different TV shows, I think that exposing ourselves to different people, ideas, concepts, engaging with people, I think that that's all a very important long-term thing as well. And I think the last thing, I think Tim's anecdote is very powerful. I think that there has to be a certain amount of grace and empathy and humanity that needs to be demonstrated right now to all. I think that goes a long way, and it's better to be effective than right. And I think that that's partially what Mandela was pushing as well.
What about you, Tim? I give you all the resources in the world.
I think the key thing is to find really the most effective platform for reaching the American people with evidence. And I don't mean just scientific evidence, that's really important, but that evidence that certain ways of approaching this work actually works. One of the things, and I'm sure Scott, you and others find, there are so many well-intended programs on a range of issues that we don't have any evidence if they actually work, right? Are they actually creating the behavioral change we want? Or are they counterproductive? Are they priming threats? And, we are working with a researcher at Harvard who's, for the last 2 years, has been looking at, games, online games that people play. and he's an expert in cooperation. And what he's been doing and getting great results is finding people who are conservatives and liberals, but know they're both conservative and liberals, play games, and get rewarded for their cultural knowledge. So their identities are being rewarded in cooperation rather than negated as this is profound disagreement or I find your position abhorrent. And I'll give you a final quick little anecdote. So they had a Republican, not a Republican, a conservative and a liberal. And the question they had in front of them is, name the cast of Duck Dynasty. And it turns out most of the conservatives could name the cast and not the liberals. But then the other question they both had to deal with as two team members is name the cast of Stranger Things. And liberals were more adept at naming the cast of Stranger Things. So by each being rewarded for what they knew within their groups and that cultural sort of language, they both won. And that kept on being reinforced, not manipulated. And what we're finding is playing a 1 hour game like that is lasting for months in terms of people reducing their polarization, where they're saying, it's okay. And there's a lot of research that shows that one way to break down divides and polarization is cooperation, mutual benefit in cooperation. And that there's a lot of research and science on that. So if I could find more and more of these opportunities and get them out there in different ways, I think that's key.
So maybe that relates actually to Scott's earlier suggestion to engage more in local politics projects, which can maybe overcome those cultural silos that we seem to be so entrenched in. I would like to thank you both so much for bringing this really important topic and discussing it in such a thoughtful way. I would like to thank the audience that had all these wonderful questions that I keep going through and adding them. Scott, would you like to say something for conclusion?
I really appreciate the time and the conversation. I think that this is probably the most important vexing challenge in American democracy and politics today is how we're going to move forward from these levels of polarization. And so I appreciate Tim's research and appreciate all the great questions as well.
Tim?
Well, Mikhail, thank you, my friend, as a great moderator and colleague. I want to thank Scott. It's been a real honor and privilege, sharing this platform with you and hope to learn more about your work. But also GBH, Suffolk, Ford Hall Forum, and everybody that attended. I was looking at some of the questions and there were a lot of really good ones. I mean, I would say all of them were great, but this is a really key moment. And I have had more calls from people I've worked with around the world who feel that this election has as much impact on their democracy as it does on American democracy. And so what's happening here has huge consequences. And so we all have to vote, no matter where people vote and how they vote. And we have to recognize what is the very civic future of this country as citizens and not just as partisans.
We all have to think about how do we engage a little bit more, just a little bit outside our comfort zone. Thank you so much again. Thank you, the Ford Hall Forum, and have a good night.